War fever has taken over the United States. Uh, the Spanish have called the American president weak. Uh, Cuba and their revolution is getting bloodier and bloodier, and it's affecting the American economy, and American lives are at stake. And the USS Maine uh, has exploded, and many Americans and yellow journalists are blaming the Spanish. And so the United States is under a lot of pressure to go to war with Spain. And so the President of the United States, William McKinley, decides that it's time for war. So he goes to Congress and gives a message to Congress asking for war for several reasons. He wants to put an end to the bloodshed and miseries in Cuba. He wants to protect the lives of Americans in Cuba. He wants to protect our economic interests in the Caribbean. And he wants to end the what he calls the constant menace to our peace in Cuba. And really, we just want to get Spain out of the Caribbean. That's really kind of what's going on here. And so Congress authorizes war and passes, part of their authorization was the Teller Amendment that promised Cuba, look, we're going to fight this war against Spain, and you guys help us out, and then when we're done, you will get your independence. We won't own you. We will not occupy your country and own you as a protectorate or annex you. You're going to be your own country. That's what we promised Cuba. And so we go to war. And so this war is going to be fought on two fronts, kind of like World War II that was fought in Europe and in the Pacific, at least for the Americans. The United States is going to fight the Spanish-American War in two places. First, in the Caribbean, right over there, right next to us, but also thousands of miles away in the Pacific Ocean, in a series of islands that we call the Philippines, the Philippine Islands. And so this is kind of a world war as well. You know, it's a war fought all over the world. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. And remember how far Spain is, right? Way over here in Europe. And so this is a war that has really broad aspects to it. But the United States is going to fight on a Caribbean front and on the Pacific front in the Philippines. And so let's start with the Caribbean front. So on the Caribbean front, there are a couple really significant moments in this really short war. Obviously, there's not going to be a long list of battles because this was a 3-month war. There's not that much that happens. But one of the most famous moments of the war is the Rough Riders. Now, we got to remember that the United States was not prepared for war. The soldiers that go to Cuba to fight in this war are mostly volunteers. They're commoners, they're farmers, miners that suit up and go to war. And one of those volunteers is Teddy Roosevelt. He was the assistant secretary of the Navy. He's not a soldier, but he decides he wants the glory and he wants to go fight in a war and have that under his belt. So he suits up as a volunteer, and this group of volunteers becomes known as the Rough Riders, and they're led by Colonel Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And one of the famous moments they have in the war is the taking of San Juan Hill. This is a really famous battle in the Spanish-American War, and what I want you to do is click on this YouTube link, and so pause this video and go watch that 6-minute reenactment of the storming of San Juan Hill, and you'll see Teddy Roosevelt with his little spectacles leading the American soldiers, the volunteers, up San Juan Hill. And keep in mind also that one of the groups of people who doesn't get a lot of credit for this battle, kind of gets drowned out by Teddy Roosevelt, are African Americans. African American volunteers in the Spanish-American War were crucial to the victory. So go ahead and pause this video and go watch that reenactment. One of the other things I want to mention is that the United States is going to lose soldiers. They're going to die. They're going to have casualties, but really not that many to Spanish bullets. You know, they're facing Spanish bullets, but the more deadly thing that they're facing during this war is disease in the Caribbean. That's going to kill a lot more Americans than bullets will. So here's some pictures of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders On the left, you can see Teddy Roosevelt in the middle, and they're just cowboys going into war, basically, right? And on the right, there's Theodore Roosevelt again. This is a guy with a ton of energy and wants the glory that a lot of people, believe war gets you. And then usually when they go to war, they realize it's hell. It's not a positive part of life. It doesn't bring glory. It brings drama. Uh, so on the Caribbean front, the second major event is that the United States Navy destroys the Spanish fleet at Santiago Bay. And this is one of the things that's going to end up ending the war, is that Spain doesn't have any more ships. And they realize they can't fight a war that's so far away from their country without ships. So that's going to be an important moment in the war. So turning thousands of miles away to the Philippines, way over here in the Pacific Ocean. Why in the world is the United States attacking the Philippines? Well, the Philippines, as you might guess, have been a Spanish colony since the 1500s. You'll remember that it was the Spanish explorers who were the first to go around the globe, and one of their stops, one of the places where they hit, was the Philippines. And so from that moment on, the Philippines were a Spanish colony. Now, the United States, especially our man Teddy Roosevelt, sorry I'm covering him up there, he's going to recognize the strategic importance of those islands. If we can get those islands from the Spanish, it's kind of a gateway to Asia. We're trying at this point to expand our horizons and expand our empire. And if we can get the Philippines, it's kind of a good little port into Asia, so we can open up trade opportunities with China and the subcontinent of India. There's all kinds of resources that we could get if we had a good base somewhere over there in the Pacific. And so that's one of the reasons we attack the Philippines. So on the Pacific front, what ends up happening is that Roosevelt and the United States Armed Forces order their commander, George Dewey, who is stationed in Hong Kong. You can see that on the map on the Chinese mainland. They tell him to go to the Philippines and attack the Spanish. And that's what he does. Commodore George Dewey and his fleet attack Spanish ships in Manila Bay. And on land, U.S. troops ally with Filipino rebels and capture the city of Manila. This was no easy feat. There was a lot of really bloody fighting, and it was very difficult, but they end up succeeding and taking Manila and successfully taking the Philippine Islands. And you got to think that the Filipinos are thinking, we're going to be able to be independent finally from Spain. The United States has come over here and saved us, and now we're going to be able to be independent. Not so much. We'll get to that in a minute. And so Spain realizes that this war is over. They lost the battle in the Philippines. They lost the battles in the Caribbean. They don't have a fleet anymore. It's been destroyed in the Caribbean. And so they're going to ask the United States for terms of peace. And so let's just talk for a minute about the results of the war. The first results, obviously, is the Treaty of Peace. And so there are several parts to this treaty. Number one, it recognized Cuban independence. If you'll remember, we promised Cuba that if we won this war, they would be independent. And so Spain is now out of the Caribbean. And that's really significant because Spain no longer has any colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And they have been there for 300 years. So this is really the end of Spain as a world power. Cuba gets their independence. Second, the United States gets Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain. Puerto Rico in the Caribbean still belongs to the United States, and Guam in the Pacific. We got that island from the Spanish as well. Next part of the treaty was that the United States gets the Philippines. So we basically gave Spain $20 million and said, the Philippines are now ours. Now this is very controversial because the Filipinos were under the impression that if they helped us defeat the Spanish, we would give them their independence, kind of like we did for Cuba. And so this starts off a lot of controversy in the United States. You have the imperialists who want to expand our empire and believe we should annex the Philippines and use them as a gateway to Asia. And you have the anti-imperialists who are vehemently against annexing the Filipino country. They point to the Declaration of Independence, and they're saying, this is a crowded set of islands. We're going over there to take this land from these people, and we're depriving them of the values that we expressed in the Declaration of Independence. We're taking their life, liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. And Filipinos were outraged that they would not be given their independence. And this is going to lead to a war, because the United States is going to take the land and claim that it's theirs. And this is going to lead to the Philippine-American War. And the Philippine Islands are not going to gain their independence until after World War II in 1946. So this was a really controversial part of the peace treaty. So the next result of the war is the Platt Amendment. Basically, we worked out a deal with Cuba. We said, all right, you can have your independence. We're going to give you that. But we want to use your land to have a base and to keep troops in Cuba, because we want to make sure that no European country comes over there and starts to influence Cuba again. And so one of the locations that the United States negotiates is Guantanamo Bay. And you might recognize the name of that base. That's where the United States, during the War of Terror that's still going on, the war against terror that's happening right now, that's where we take a lot of the prisoners of war, is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Second, so the election of 1900. Anytime you win a war, that president is going to be really popular. And so President McKinley is very popular and is reelected for a second term. And this time, he selects as his vice president the new war hero of the Spanish-American War, the Rough Rider himself, Teddy Roosevelt. And this is really significant because we know that McKinley is going to get assassinated shortly after taking office in 1901, which is going to make Theodore Roosevelt president of the United States. And he's going to be one of our most influential, popular presidents. Another result of the war is recognition of U.S. power, and this is really the most important result of the Spanish-American War. The United States now is a world power. European nations see us as a world power. Our Navy is one of the strongest in the world, and that's impressing a lot of nations. We now have territories all over the world. Let me go to the next slide. We are now essentially an empire. We have annexed and bought Alaska from Russia. We have annexed Hawaii. We got Puerto Rico. We got the Philippines and Guam, and we're kind of a protectorate. Well, Cuba is a protectorate of us, right? We've got troops in their territory, and so we kind of have an empire now, and that's one of the biggest significant outcomes of this war, is that the United States is going to enter a period where they are an empire and they want to stay an empire.